You're syncing up and tuning in to the Lending Link podcast, powered by GDS Link, where the modern day lender can dive deeper into the future of data, decisioning, and credit risk solutions. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am your host, Rich Alterman, and today we're syncing up with Kount's Carlos Osuna Zemelman. Carlos is the Senior Director of International Business Development with Kount, a provider of artificial intelligence-driven fraud prevention and digital identity solutions, which was acquired by Equifax in February 2021. With 17 years combined experience working with global brands, Carlos has an extensive knowledge of Latin American markets and a proven ability to build and execute complex business strategies. Throughout his career, he has served as a trusted strategic advisor to executives and has taken a variety of leadership roles within marketing, product management, fraud strategy, and business development. Carlos studied business engineering at the Adolfo Ibáñez University, where he also earned his master's in human resources with a specialization in management excellence. Carlos also served as external staff for the World Economic Forum, participating in their annual Davos meeting. On this episode, Carlos and I are discussing a wide range of topics surrounding trends for Latin America in 2023, what's happening in the world of e-commerce, why companies in the fraud space are growing so rapidly, and so much more. But before we dive into the interview, please head over to GDS Link's LinkedIn and Twitter pages at GDS Link and hit those like and follow buttons. If you had not done so already, please subscribe to the Lending Link on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. All right, now let's get synced with GDS Link. Welcome, Carlos. I hope you've had a productive week. It certainly has been an interesting week for the financial markets. Where are you joining me from today?
Hi, Rich. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to talk and chat a little bit. I'm currently in Atlanta, Roswell, Atlanta. I was born in Chile, so I've got that Latino blood in me.
Well, thanks, and thanks for joining today. Carlos, you've been with Equifax for 10 years now, but only in your current role since January of this year. Can you please share a bit about your role, more on your background before stepping into your current role, as well as before starting with Equifax?
I just changed into a new role. It's a global role focused on the business development of Kount internationally. For our organization, I'm part of the Equifax group. Kount, and the way we look at international is everything except the US, so every single market except of the US. So I'm overseeing that whole market since the beginning of this year. And yeah, it's a great opportunity. A little bit of Kount for us, it's like the startup of the company. It has that soul, that spirit. So when you go to their offices, they've got that startup look, all the employees, the hoodies, the t-shirts, sneakers. I tend to feel old. When I thought I was young, I get there and no, I'm not young anymore. But a little bit of my background, I studied business in Chile. One of the things that I learned when I was studying was that there was a need in the HR business. Chile is that skinny little country down in South America that's predominantly copper producer in the world. And obviously that's kind of what drives our economy. And a lot of people want to work there, but there was a lot of opportunities in the HR side. And that's why I decided to do a master's degree. I had a job 2 minutes after I got out of the university.
Wow.
It was a great opportunity, learned a lot, had the most amazing events of my life. Like I saw snow avalanches in the Andes. I had sudden collapse, the ground in some of the underground mines that we operated. I mean, we had sad events too, where we lost a lot of employees. And I was on the HR side, but not on the HR that hires people. I was more on the contract and administration of most of the mines operate with a house on the mine, right? So you have apartment buildings, you have to feed the employees, you have to move them into the mine, etc. So I was responsible for all those contracts for a long while. I ended up moving into Equifax. It's been 10 years, as you mentioned. It's been a fantastic journey. I've been in every single role that exists in the Latin American team. From being HR the first 6 months, and then moving into PMO roles, operations roles, billing roles, strategy, product. And for the last 2 years, I've been working with the the Kount team, and growing, our business footprint outside of the US. We've always been global, but now we're taking it even more seriously with the help of our Equifax brand and, Equifax knowledge and teams.
Quite impressive background. I understand that you're a pretty avid mountain biker, and you've had some interesting experience. It can be a pretty intense sport. Do you find it as a way to kind of relax from the day-to-day work going on at Kount, or do you actually find mountain biking? You talked about mountain biking in the Alps once. It can be pretty hairy there, I guess.
Yeah, you did a good investigation about myself. So yeah, now I started to find it funny to say that I'm a mountain biker because I'll give you an example. Every time I go to the headquarters of Kount in Boise, when I say I'm a mountain biker and they know I live in Atlanta, they start laughing. Like they laugh at my face. Like, where do you go? To the hills of Roswell? I've been biking for the last almost 25 years. Since I was young, I would be on my bike. So yeah, I would say it's a good way to break stress, have fun, do sports. It can be dangerous. I've had multiple injuries doing it. I've learned that the best type of biking, especially when you're already getting close to the 40s, you already have a family and you have to be more careful what you do because you're the provider, right? Or at least in my case, cross-country biking is really fantastic. It has risk like any type of sports, but it's not like doing downhill, and it's great for your health, but also great for, breaking stress, the daily stress that we get on our daily jobs.
Well, you could always take some of your coworkers over to Stone Mountain and ride down Stone Mountain. That's a pretty intense experience. Okay, well, let's get down to business. So speaking about Kount, where you work, what's the history behind Kount? How'd you guys get started? And, what was the use case that Kount was initially built to address?
That's a really interesting story. Kount has about 16 years in the business. It really started in terms of helping the payment side. Kount's bread and butter has been always on the payments, on the online payments. Mm-hmm. So what we call, right, card not present. Card not present for years has been where most of the fraud occurs. If we look at the card present, you normally have a chip on the credit card, right? Before we only had the band. Once they started putting the chip on the credit card, there's still a little bit of fraud, but it's much less than in the past. And in that case, Kount was trying to solve, can I solve the card not present, where a bin can be stolen, all the data around that bin on the credit card can be stolen, and could be debit card too, right? And how can we prevent from what we call chargebacks, right? Which affect thousands and millions of merchants today on a daily basis. So the initial idea was, how do we protect them? Kount is the first company to build the ID fingerprint of the device ID fingerprint, sorry. Mm-hmm. What is fantastic is that they didn't stop with the first patent. They have the first patent in the world. They started evolving it. We today have over 30 patents. Now, that use case was really strong for a long while, but then all those data attributes that are being used to prevent the payment side are very similar to the ones we see in other sides of the business. So when we're talking about account creation, for example, today in our digital world, maybe 16 years ago, it wasn't that much, but today, nobody goes to the bank to open their first account, right? It's right. Like we're doing it with a computer or with even your iPhone, right? Or your whatever type of device you're using. So again, there's a lot of need in terms of what information you have around that device and that digital persona in order to move ahead. So Kount, though it's started on the payment, started evolving and moving into other sides of the business. And today we are the only company in the world that can prevent what we call an end-to-end digital transaction as an anti-fraud tool. And we can create those digital personas and prevent the merchants or the customers at the back, right, of being defrauded or being attacked by fraudsters. So we're in the account creation. We cover all the space around logins to a site, payments, different types of payments, because you could have credit card payments, you could have crypto payments, you could have one-time payments or recurrent payments, right? which also have different types of fraud around it. And then what we call compliance, but includes all this. How can you stop chargebacks? How can you dispute them? And recently we've also incorporated representment. So how can you dispute with that tool and then automatize it from zero without having to do heavy lifting of data and filling in manual work?
So, Carlos, just for some of our audience, sometimes we have to appreciate that our listeners may not know what certain terms actually mean. So, talk about quickly, what does it mean when we talk about a chargeback? What does it mean when we talk about representment? And I understand that you bought a company last year called Mitigator. So maybe talk about how Mitigator helps in those areas and why you acquired them.
So the chargeback really is when a consumer is calling their issuing bank and saying, this transaction is not mine, right? And what happens is basically that transaction is already happened, right? And the merchant tends to be liable for the money that on that transaction. So what normally happens is that the consumer calls the issuing bank stops this, calls it as a transaction. So who's liable ends up being the merchant. What we do is we protect our merchants and help them prevent fraud that can come from that process.
So part of that could be what we call friendly fraud, right? Where I actually did make the purchase, right? But then I turn around and I say, I didn't make the purchase. Or it could be where someone has stolen or taken over my account where they're actually shipping to a different address than my home address. And for our listeners, right, we all see now when we open up our credit card statements online, there's an opportunity to dispute, right, any one of those charges. So it's actually become easier for some of that friendly fraud, right, to occur today than it was maybe in the past.
Yeah, exactly. And then the dispute part it's the instance also that the merchant can have to represent against that chargeback. In order to do that, you need a lot of information. So you need the digital transaction information. You need information that you might have received, right? So did you send the good? Did you not send it? Do you have a picture of the good being picked up or not, etc.? And you can file that and you have to send it to the brands, the credit card brands. Mm-hmm. There's a process where they revise it and they take a decision. That's Mitigator, which is the company that we acquired recently, incorporates the representment and also some additional tools that exist for merchants in order to deflect chargebacks. So we incorporate in real-time information towards the brands, so American Express, a Visa, Discover, etc. When the issuing bank is receiving a claim from the consumer, there are some platforms they use. We're able to connect in real time and provide the information of the transaction so that that agent on the bank can try to make that consumer remember about that purchase. That happens in real time. So we basically acquired Mitigator to expand our footprint in the fraud space, the transactional fraud space, and that was mainly the purpose.
I was reading on Statista.com that in 2023, the e-commerce fraud is expected to be about $48 billion, which is an incredible number. And by 2025, the e-commerce fraud detection and prevention market, which is where Kount plays, is expected to reach over $69 billion. So it's certainly a growing area, right? It's a threat that continues to increase. Fraudsters get smarter every day. So certainly your type of tools and artificial intelligence and things like that help combat. You mentioned crypto. Does crypto present any unique challenges from a fraud perspective that may be different from using a card?
No, for us, it's more a transaction and similar to what you could be using a debit card, a ACH account. So we're basically just connecting the dots around what we see associated with that device, that email. If it was a credit card, we would see velocities, right? Crypto, that would be the only thing that might be different, but there are some codes that we can use to add in and basically confirm it's not fraud.
So at GDS, most of our clients, and hopefully a lot of them are going to be listening to this podcast, are really more on the lending side, whether it's doing consumer lending or small business lending. So when we think about fraud, and you talk about fraud on the e-commerce side versus on the lending side, are there some nuances to think about or at the end of the day, is it relatively ubiquitous?
What we see is that in terms, all fraud is complementary. So whatever you've earned in terms of knowledge if we're looking at the payment side, you can also extrapolate on other areas. So let's talk about account takeover. If you had a consumer that is using a device that you've never seen before, why would you let them into their account, right? Why not send them a second authentication factor? If you're seeing high velocities with that device, for example, why would you want to let them in? Same thing on the account creation. The lending space, from my vision, is that the lending space, the highest risk is when you start that onboarding process and you have this customer where maybe you only do a KYC, but you're not checking other lines. We have great examples across Latin America that has high fraud in the lending space, where we see that a customer comes in, does bad use of information, starts transacting afterwards, and then they start combining other household members to use either introduce their credit card, etc., and then come back another person in that household and open an account. If you're not protecting where your account creation part and contributing the information you have on the transactional side, you have high risks that you'll continue having fraud coming in back and forth. So basically, we tend to say complement information. If you're like in a buy now, pay later space, whatever is happening on your payment side on those installments, you need to incorporate it in the front door and who's coming in, because it could be one of the members that committed fraud at the last part of your process.
Yeah, that makes sense. So as in lending, e-commerce merchants want a solution that maximizes revenue, mitigates fraud, provides a great customer experience, and clearly trying to reduce friction and abandonment rates. So how does Kount really help satisfy all of those tenets? And are there any use cases that you might share where you've helped, a company address those points?
That's a great question. And I would say that's where we've been shifting. Many companies have been talking about fraud, and fraud was the problem. And we've been seeing that if you're not using correctly your fraud tools, you're not only generating a problem in the fraud space, or just you're generating also a problem in your revenue lines.
Right.
We've got a great example on one of the largest cinema in Peru, for example. They had a high percentage of decline rates on their e-commerce. Rich, when was the last time you bought a ticket for the cinema at the cinema?
Well, unfortunately, with COVID, I haven't been in a cinema, I don't think, since the pandemic started, although I might have seen Maverick. But typically, to your point, you're going to go to Fandango or something like that and buy it online.
And this is worldwide. People, and I would say that cinemas are part of those companies that have been way ahead in the e-commerce world. Maybe at the beginning you were calling on the phone, right? But why were you doing this? Because you want a spot once you get into the cinema, right?
Right.
So cinemas have been in this e-commerce world for years. And this specific customer was having high decline rates, and they couldn't know why it was happening. At the beginning, they did everything, and they got to a point that they thought this was the norm. And in their business cases, they had already provisioned that as, okay, 20% or over that as decline rates. And the reality is that if decline rates are not because of funds in the credit card or in the debit card, they shouldn't be that level at all.
Right.
There is
right.
a problem. What we addressed was that basically there was a lot of improvement to be done on the rules. So today we've been shifting our way of thinking, and it's anti-fraud tools can be a way of increasing your revenues, especially for those that are not using the correct or addressing correctly the policies around the rules that you're using. You mentioned before the increase in e-commerce, right? And how fraudsters just like create new ways of fraud every day, right? So there's always a human element that you need to incorporate on these tools. But I would say the most important part is the second part is you can't be changing rules every day yourself, right? Or with a human person. So combining both worlds with AI and machine learning and the power of our human brains, that's where we're living today with Kount, and helping customers, have the best-in-class tool, best-in-class policies to avoid fraud, prevent them from having false positive, as we call in our industry, around decline rates, have as much sales as possible with the lowest amount of chargeback and fraud possible.
I mean, the use of AI in a credit card authorization, right, has been around for a very, very long time. HNC was the developer of Falcon, which was a neural net technology. I think we were dealing with them over 40 years ago. So it's really nothing new, right? But with the advances in technology, things get better and better and better, and more data, right? And let's kind of talk about that. One of the assets of Kount is what you call your Identity Trust Global Network, which is as I understand it, a consortium. So can you kind of talk more about the Trust Global Network and how that works? I assume that, your clients really kind of operate under this give to get model, where if you're part of the network, you have to be not only using the data on the front end, but then potentially reporting back performance and other things on the back end. So could you give us more insight on how that works?
Yeah, that's how we live. That's how we work and operate today. Not being an expert in data attributes, right? So I just want to make sure that that's how we operate in our consortium of data and our identity trust data network is basically we combine different elements. So there's a first element of digital identifier data that we cover, location, payments, and then what we call UDFs, which is unique customer data. On the digital identifier data, what we're able to capture with our solution is a device ID. We are able to capture IP addresses. As you know, IP addresses are a very important element. If you're seeing that multiple users are posted onto the same IP, it's what we call hot IP. It's probably, it has higher risk of fraud, right? Then email. So we've got score over the emails. We're able to analyze the email. Do the words contained on that email look created by a machine, or it's a normal human-made email? How many times have we seen it in our network? How many associations have we seen? So in the digital identifier data is any element that we can study around that device, email, etc. On the location data is, especially if you're in the payment side, when you're buying anything, you have to put an address, right? So if there's an address that's associated to multiple fraud, for example, schemes, obviously that's a trigger for our network. We don't create blacklists in our network. Our network is wide open, and basically each customer creates their own lists inside, because a good customer for you could be a very bad customer for us, right? But on the location, going back to that point, is we're able to capture almost everything around that location, that either the device is or the billing address that's being appointed. Payments, any type of payment type or token or bank information, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the UDFs, so user-defined fields, what we do here is open the opportunity for our customers to send us in real-time data. So I'll give you an example, coupon codes. There's been a lot of bad use of promotional codes in the past, right? We're able to make sure that that coupon is used once and not multiple times, for example. A loyalty point, or when we're in the airline industry, there's a lot of information around that ticket that needs to be sent to us. For example, where are you going? What's the name of the airport there you're landing at? What's the time between, if you have a stop, right? What's the time between you land and you have to take the other plane? There's strict rules around that, because you can't be taking a flight that's 5 minutes after you land and you're probably going to miss it, right?
Right.
So there's things that could be for fraud, other things that just to operate correctly. You don't want customers buying tickets on the airline side that you basically are going to lose. So that's how, more or less how we operate, the information that we can capture. I would say the beauty of it is how we can combine it in order to create a score and then provide a assessment for a customer to take a decision, right, in real time. Our score is based on 2 layers, a supervised model, which basically is a statistical model, more data, in more time, the more calibrated. And the unsupervised machine model is basically a regressional linkage of data in real time. So how many times have I seen this phone, this address, this email in my consortium of data? The more I've seen it, for example, it could be more risky. Depending on the use, it could be either more risk or less risk.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the airline. My wife had all of her points stolen from one of the airlines, and we were able to get it back. And I had all of my points stolen from one of my hotel programs. And I don't think people think about that, right? Those things have value, and fraudsters will find a way. So you got to protect yourself there. One of the things I was thinking about on the global network is that you deal with multiple geographies and you deal with multiple industries. And this data is all in the same repository. Think about maybe someone visiting a casino where they are transacting a lot with the same card because they keep, unfortunately, losing. So with all of this unique data in the repository, does that create any unique challenges? Or are you able to, maybe by SIC code or NACSI code, kind of able to set up strategies that would be unique to the different types of e-commerce that any one merchant's doing?
I would say that that's what many of our competitors struggle with. I'd say that's a strong spot for us. We, as I mentioned before, we don't set black, white, or whatever type of lists inside our data, because you just put the best example. When you're in the gambling space, you're going to see a lot of velocity with that credit card, right? There's emotions around that consumer. And if let's say we had a rule that's setting, if it's the velocities are X amount because it's the average of the market, the gambling industry would fail in that sense, right? That you would impact them negatively. So our solution works based on over 250 models that can be used, turned on, turned off, right? Depending on the industry you are, you'll probably have high velocities as a trigger of fraud, or you won't have, right? That's the element of humans that you need to incorporate in these solutions, and that's what we incorporate. So if we know that you're in the gambling industry, your rule set's going to be very different from maybe an airline industry on the loyalty point side, right? We operate differently. We've got based on industries, you'll have best practices that we see in terms of the policies that we implement for our customers, the rules that are set on the models, for example, that are impacting them, and how AI works might shift or defer depending on who you are and what industry you play in.
Let's hop on a plane and take a quick trip down to Latin America and leverage some of your experience there, get some frequent flyer points on Delta. So, as preparing for this podcast, started reading a lot up on Latin America. It's an interesting growing market. There's been a rapid increase in the use of mobile phones. There's a big problem down there, banked and unbanked consumers. But I also read that last year there were, I think, 50 unicorns that came out of Latin America. So it's an impressive market. For clients that are listening to this podcast, or companies that are either on the lending side or maybe on the vendor side that are looking at Latin America as a potential opportunity, any insights you can share with us, given how much time you spent down there, on some of the opportunities for those companies, as well as maybe some of the challenges working in Latin America?
And so it's a fascinating market. I think Latin America, for a while, we had in terms of technology, we were some steps behind most of the countries. There's some exceptions to the rules, right? But I would say most of them were a little bit behind all the developed countries. And when you're behind the technology, what you'll see is that the way you operate on a daily basis changes. So the e-commerce world, though it was growing, it wasn't growing as fast as you would see it in the US or in other places, or the adoption of the e-commerces, to be more concrete, right? It was growing fast, but the adoption was still lagging. Why? You didn't have a lot of unbanked population, so they didn't have access to a credit card, for example. And most of the services were physical, right? So if you wanted to open your bank account, go to the bank, right?
Right.
Things completely shifted after the pandemic. So we've got a before and after. I still remember I was in I was in Costa Rica the week where everything got closed. I left one day before they closed the airport of Costa Rica. But that week, I was with one of the largest financial institutions there. I was presenting another tool, which basically was enabling them to kind of assess credit scores in real time so that they could also use it on online world. I still remember the director of that institution saying, "Hey, I love it. This is fantastic, but we're 10 years behind this. No, I would love to have it. It's not something that we need right now."
Right.
Lockdown comes in. I safely got back home here in Atlanta. I can tell you 3 months later, we had a call like, we need this now.
Right, right, right.
So there was a rush. The world changed in most of Latin America because you had no way. You could not get out of your house. So what did you do? So most of the governments started enabling them opening accounts, digital accounts, bank accounts. So there's a ramp up in terms of access or cashless use in Latin America post or during the pandemic. That enabled and helped the e-commerce grow as it grew right now. So most of the companies were growing so fast in the e-commerce world, right? Because the governments helped to enable what is needed to grow in the e-commerce world, right? So you need cashless solutions like a credit card, like a debit card, etc. That's one thing that happened. So I would say that if we look at Latin America today, though there's still a gap against the developed country, a lot got closed during the pandemic, thanks to, the need of having access to cashless solutions, the use of e-commerce, having population tested and seeing it at work, etc. What are the risks? I think, and I think most of the companies are seeing it today. Many rushed into technologies that weren't adequate for them or weren't prepared for them. And that's kind of what we're seeing today. A lot of fraud was not considered that risky at that time. Why? Because they were growing so fast that fraud was 2 points, again, 20 points, like who cares, right? Right. Now people are going to restaurants, to other places, right? So the e-commerce is slowing a little bit, right? Because your total portfolio of cash needs to split with other things, right? That now those 2 points, 5 points of fraud are now something that you're looking at and saying, hey, I want those points as revenue now, or I don't want that fraud because I'm either losing the product, etc. So I would say many are now revising what the decisions they took 2-3 years ago and how they change into more modern solutions. There's investigating more. Remember, they had to shift to online in less than a month. Who takes a great decision in less than a month?
Well, look, there's no doubt it was a global accelerant to move to digital. We know there's a large population of unbanked or underbanked, and it's still a strong cash society. Is a lot of that cultural? I mean, we see it here in the U.S. as well, right? Where the Mexican population, there seems to be almost a fear of banks in some regard. So is some of that cultural, and you have to kind of break through that barrier to get people more comfortable to use online financial products?
I have to share my point of view, not necessarily my company's point of view, or it's my perspective. So I think it's a combination of traditions of having the cash, sleeping with the cash under your pillow. It's something that normally happens. I think there's also a mix of, there's a lot of taxation, the taxes, right? If you're on cash, it's easier not to pay the taxes. So I think it's more a cultural thing, as you're saying. There's also the tradition of having the cash. The trust is on you, not on others, right? You don't know where it's going. You're not seeing it. You're not feeling it, smelling it. So yeah, I would say it's a little bit of that. Education too. There's a part of education. And then there's a little bit of the experience of others that have had, we've had a lot of financial crises in some countries. And I think that the fear of those happening again is part of the risk that these people are feeling.
Look what we went through this past weekend. I know it's had an impact in Latin America, what happened this past weekend. And I understand that it's even more complicated for some of the fintechs down there on what they're going to do next. And anyway, we're getting close to needed to wrap this up. You and I could talk for a long time. So I'm going to ask this question because I think it'd be really helpful to the audience. I'm going to hire you as a consultant, and I want you to put together an RFP for me on identifying and developing a fraud, or implementing, I should say, a fraud solution. What would be some of the key things that you would have me looking at from an RFP perspective as I'm evaluating a company like Kount or any one of your many competitors?
That's a really good question. So I always start with strategy. So I always try to have a company that has a complete strategy. If your company is only in one side of the business and not multiple, you're only getting attributes of data that are located in one side. So as I was saying, an end-to-end solution is critical because you're getting more data entries or data attributes around fraud, and fraud is changing every day. So if you're just looking at one side, you're probably going to get hit on the other two. So a complete strategy is fundamental. I would include that. The other is the expertise that it's around that team, and then the models that they're running at the back end. So models that have been trained and tested multiple times. There's a lot of startup solutions that are coming, but they're lacking on the data network. Their models would be fantastic, but how are they modeled if they don't have the data or the element of expertise in time? So that's the other area that I would for sure request on that RFP. Trusted large brands that have been operating on it. And then I would say flexible technology. It's very fundamental when you're looking at our space, is that the OpEx you have to invest in these type of solutions is reduced, right? Your developer time is always in a fight against a huge backlog. So why do I put this first, or do I not put it at the end, right? So you need to have a flexible technology that if you don't need the end-to-end solution, maybe you just hire one model and you start small and you grow in time once the solution's proven that it's working and working correctly. I would say those three elements. And then when you go back into what has to be contained, that trusted data network is fundamental. New companies might have the best teams, right, and best models built up, but if you don't have the data to test them, I don't know where you build. AI and machine learning is really relevant. To think that just with human rules and policies, you're going to be going fine today, no. In the past, maybe. Today, you need AI and machine learning. Any tool that is static and rule-based, I would immediately not move ahead with them. And the last part is what us as humans touch, right? That platform. How does that platform interact? Is it user-friendly? Do I need to know code in order to create a new policy or rule? Imagine the cost of hiring those employees, right? Training them. We've had a big turnover, right? Or just think about the company. Like if tomorrow they need to be trained by by a third party in order to set the rules, then you never want to, you can't. That person is like so important that nothing can happen to them, right? They can't leave, they can't take any other decision. So I would say that those elements are really important when you're building an RFP. That's how I would assess it.
So with the availability now of ChatGPT, our listeners could apply ChatGPT to this podcast and say, please develop an RFP for me using the talking points that Carlos just laid out.
Probably.
Okay, so one final question, more of a personal question to wrap this up. You've lived across the Americas, Santiago, Caracas, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Atlanta, and even in Cairo. If you had to leave the States and move back to one of those places, where would you go and why?
I've got half of my family in Santiago, and I've got a huge love for my country. I think it's a fantastic place to live. I would choose Santiago.
Okay, great. This is Rich Alterman, and we've been syncing up with Carlos Osuna Zemelman, Senior Director of International Business Development with Kount. Thank you, Carlos, for joining me today. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And be sure to leave us a review. Follow us on LinkedIn and connect with us on Twitter at GDSLink. That's at GDSLINK. Have a question for the show or have a specific topic you want us to cover? Hit the link in the description to drop us a note. Thank you for lending us part of your day. Make it a great one.